Morning, everybody. Welcome to another lesson in our series called How the Story Ends. And I know it's a really bad name because this series has felt like it's been eternal. Like as eternal as God's word, this series seems like it's gone on that long. But we are, I promise, getting close to the end of how the story ends. And in the process of that, we're going to move on to something else at some point in the future. But for now, we have a few more items to discuss as we're taking a look at the end of the story of God's Word. And of course, the end of that story is a bit of a scary end, I guess you could say, or at least certainly a very dramatic and suspenseful end. A lot of pain and suffering and trial and tribulation in the last few years of human history as God wraps up all of the loose ends, ties up all the loose ends, brings about rescue for his people, but also judgment for the wicked. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We've been discussing one of the series of judgments that God has, I guess you could say, is going to be pouring out literally on the earth at the end times. And this one, the bowl judgments, take place in the very last few, I think, days or weeks or maybe couple of months of this 7-year period of time that some people call the tribulation period and also is called the 70th week from the book of Daniel. And again, all of those things you'll have to look back at our study. I don't want to rehash all those things again. But here we are at the very end, and it seems like God's wrath is finally about to be exhausted, but there's going to be a final flurry of judgment at the very end. We talked last couple weeks about the first 6 bowl judgments that God is going to pour out, and it's going to be just the effects on the earth are going to be devastating. Sadly, though, the text tells us that even with all of these plagues that hit them, they still do not repent. In fact, they're hardened in their rebellion against God, which really demonstrates and proves why God had to bring his judgment in the first place. Because if humanity had wanted to change, if there was anything inside of them that was willing to compromise or to submit themselves to God in any way, God had given them 100 chances, maybe 1,000 chances, maybe 1,000,000 chances to turn it around. But sadly, they keep going on their merry way. And so all of the damage and the destruction is going to come. And today what I want us to focus on, and actually this Sunday and next Sunday, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of chapters here that are once more what I call a bit of a rabbit trail or a side trip or an excursus, if you like the fancy term, where basically you have the flow of action. You have bowl judgment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And remember, these happen, I think, either consecutively, like on the same day or in the same couple of days. I mean, they seem to happen one right after the other. As these 6 things are happening and you see the flow of time, the chronology continues to move. But then we come to bowl number 7, and when bowl number 7 is poured out, there's an exclamation of God judging one of his old enemies and settling what I'm calling settling an ancient debt. And as we discuss that, you'll notice then for 2 chapters, there's sort of like one more rabbit trail where we kind of figure out, okay, so who is this enemy that God is settling debts with? Who is God trying to judge? Who is this figure called Babylon the Great and all of that? And so today we're going to introduce that, and then next week we're going to come back and finish it up, and we're going to be talking about Babylon the Great, her destruction by God as a part of the 7th bowl judgment. And if you want notes for today's lesson, there should be brand new notes uploaded to our church website. If you go to the resources tab, as always, click on ABF Notes. You should be able to get these new ones. The heading should say the 7th bowl judgment, and then right underneath it, it should say God settles an ancient debt. So what I want to do is read this last paragraph of chapter 16, and then we'll also spend some time in chapter 17 and bits and pieces of chapter 18 today. And then next week we'll come back, we'll finish up the rest of chapter 18 and the first few verses of chapter 19, and then once that's over, then we're going to really jump into the final few events, the things that sort of we've been trying to get to this whole time: the second coming of Jesus Christ, the establishment of his kingdom on earth, it's often called the millennium or the millennial kingdom of Jesus. Then there's a final judgment, and then there's what's called the eternal state. So we've got some of the stuff that people think of most often when they think about the tribulation or end times, that stuff is right around the corner, right around the horizon. But before we do that, before we discuss all those things that maybe we're really curious about, the writer, John, wants us to focus in on this enemy of God's, Babylon the Great, and try to figure out, if we can, who it is, what it's all about, and how that judgment's all going to play out. Okay, so let's get into the seventh bowl judgment here in chapter 16, verse 17. So make sure you have your copy of the Bible open up to this. Have your notes out, because there'll be some blanks I want you to fill in. But here we go, chapter 16, verse 17. It says this: "The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, 'It is done.'" So this is a voice theoretically of either God the Father or of the Lamb, Jesus, who is there in the midst of the throne with the Father. And it's ironic, maybe not ironic, it's interesting that the expression, "it is done," is very, very similar to the expression that Jesus cried out from the cross, "It is finished." Now, I looked it up. There's two different Greek words here that mean sort of the same thing. But certainly there's an echo in this of that completion, right? When Jesus is on the cross, he experiences the full wrath, the full weight of God's wrath in his body. For 3 hours, he suffered that incredible wrath of God for the sins of humanity that were poured on him. And when he finished that payment, when the last bit of God's wrath was exhausted in his body and in his soul, in his spirit, which had been made sin for us, when that happened and God's wrath came to an end, he cries out from the cross, "It is finished," to telestai. Here, the word is different, but it has a similar meaning. And now that God's wrath, right, with the final bowl, it says God's wrath is finally exhausted. God's wrath finally has come to an end. And when God's wrath comes to an end, a voice cries out from the throne, right? Come out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." It is done. All of the preparation, all of God's wrath that's been stored up for centuries and millennia have now finally been poured out on humanity, on the earth. Now, obviously, right, there's a little interesting application point here. Jesus Christ bore his Father's wrath in his body to say it is finished, so that we humans would no longer have to face his wrath and his judgment. And how ironic, isn't it, that Jesus Christ said it is finished on the cross, and any of us who want to can have that count for us. But here we have the end, and it's not Jesus that is paying for this. It's not Jesus that's suffering the judgment and the wrath of God. It's all of humanity. And either way, God's like, okay, this is it. I finally poured out all the wrath that there is to pour out. In verse 18, "And there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder." Now, that's happened many different times throughout the course of this revelation. In fact, I don't know if those things are happening on earth or if those things are happening in God's presence in the heavenly scene, as we've seen in other places and in other sections. Maybe both, like maybe it's happening in heaven and on earth at the same time. But this next thing definitely happens on the earth, and it is cataclysmic. It says this: "Peals of thunder and a great earthquake, such as there had never been since man was on the earth. So great was that earthquake. The great city was split into 3 parts. The cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great," we're going to come back to this, "to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath," right? We've been talking a lot about God's wrath in these bowls. "And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. And great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe." So, how does this begin? How does the seventh bowl judgment begin? It begins with a great earthquake. That's the first blank you're to fill in there. It begins with a great earthquake. Now, I want to suggest something to you. This earthquake seems to be a worldwide earthquake. Now, the worst earthquakes that we've ever experienced here on Earth up till this point are all localized. In other words, they're one section of the Earth that feels the ramifications of it. You know, like it's along one of the fault lines of the various tectonic plates that the Earth is on, right? these things rub together, and in the process, it creates this huge earthquake. It shakes, and then it dies down, and other parts of the world wouldn't even be able to tell you that anything happened. I lived in Santiago, Chile for a long time, and we didn't have hardcore earthquakes when I was there, at least. But there'd be tremors quite often when, things would shake, and you'd kind of stand in your doorway and kind of go, okay, is this going to get bad? And always, at least the time I was there, it would die away and everything was fine. But even the worst earthquakes, like the ones that devastate cities, I think there was one recently that in the Far East that really caused a lot of damage. Earthquakes are localized to one place or another. This earthquake is the greatest of all earthquakes, and it seems like it's worldwide in scope. Now, the reason I say that it's worldwide in scope, because it causes massive destruction, not just in one area. He talks about the great city that we'll get to in just a minute, but he talks about all the cities of the earth. Did you see that? The great city, verse 19, was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. The nations is the Gentile world. That's the rest of the world outside of Israel. So all the cities of the nations fall in this earthquake. So imagine an earthquake so devastating that all the major cities that are left. Now remember, humanity has been decimated already by this, right? I imagine there are cities already that have been completely abandoned because the people in them have just either died or been killed off or run away or have escaped from a flood or whatever. Or from fire, or from invading armies. But whatever cities, wherever humanity is still, wherever people are still congregating, and we know there's still a lot of people because they're going to oppose God and oppose Jesus in the final battle. But wherever humanity is congregating in, whatever cities they're congregating in, those cities are all going to collapse into a pile of rubble. So it seems like this is an earthquake that's not just in one area over here or over there. It's hitting the whole world. Like picture all the tectonic plates in the earth at once, just completely in upheaval, like scraping and crashing and everything into one another. Like the scope of it. I mean, it's almost like the earth is coming apart at the seams. This tectonic activity is so intense that it's happening worldwide, and all the cities, all the buildings are leveled. They're a pile of rubble. Okay, and especially it points out the great city. Now, the great city, it says, was split into 3 parts. So it seems like Jerusalem, I've been to Jerusalem, it's built on the side of a hill, right? It's called Zion, the hill there. And the city, the main modern city is much bigger than the ancient city. And the modern city kind of sprawled out past the original hill through these other hills down towards the lowlands, okay? So it kind of spreads out the more people that want to go and live there. And a lot of people live in Jerusalem today. Apparently, the great city of Jerusalem is one of these cities that gets leveled in this earthquake, but it gets broken up apparently into 3 parts, it says. Separated into 3 parts. Now, the Bible never really comes back to that to explain anything about it, but again, remember, this is not primarily written for us. This is, I think, primarily written for the generation of believers alive during this period. So as they read this, and suppose maybe they're living in Jerusalem, suppose there's a few believers that are still huddled around living in Jerusalem somewhere. When they wake up the next morning, they're going to know, okay, Jerusalem has been broken into 2 or 3 major parts. Maybe there's literally cracks in the earth, like you see in some of those scary movies where the world is coming to an end. But the city is going to be broken into 3 pieces. Now, how do we know the great city is Jerusalem? If we go back to chapter 11, verse 8, I think it is, Revelation 11, verse 8, that was our discussion about the 2 witnesses. Remember those 2 guys? The 2 witnesses that kind of for 3.5 years bore witness to the people. And they were right there in Jerusalem, it says, in the city where their Lord was crucified. So that's definitely Jerusalem. And they're there, and they have their whole experience. They're killed, and then they're raised to life, and they're caught up to heaven right there from Jerusalem. And it's used that same expression, the great city. The great city. So it's very likely that this reference to the great city goes back a few chapters to chapter 11. So again, why is it called the great city? It's not because Jerusalem is the biggest city in the world. I mean, that's not even close. Jerusalem is a big city, but compare it to Mexico City, nothing. Compare it to Sao Paulo, it's nothing. Compare it to Tokyo, compare it to New York City. It's a small town in a sense compared to that. But it's called the great city, not because of its population size, but because that's where the rest of the focus is going to be. The rest of the focus is going to be on Jerusalem. That's where all the action is. That's where the temple is. That's where the Antichrist has put his image for everybody to worship. So that's happening right there in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the great city. And so Jerusalem is also a part of this, this terrifying earthquake at the end of the seventh bowl judgment. But then it says at the very end, down to verse 21, and great hailstones, about 100 pounds each. I want you to think about that. 100-pound hailstone. If a 100-pound hailstone hit a person, suppose you dropped it just from the top of the Empire State Building. That's not very far, right? You drop it a few hundred feet. It'll collect enough momentum that 100-pound boulder would crush any human and probably anything else that came in its way. Imagine if it's falling all the way from the sky, all the way from the clouds. God is hurtling, throwing rocks of hail and perhaps ice mixed with stuff like that. But he's hurtling that down 100 pounds each. What kind of devastation and destruction and loss of life is that going to cause? Now, again, one more time, we've already talked about it 100 times, so I'm barely going to mention it and then move on. How do they respond to these hailstones? Is it like, oh no, we really messed up now. We should turn back to God because God's the one who's finally bringing his judgment? No, look at their response in verse 21. And they cursed God for the plague of the hail because the plague was so severe. So once again, humanity is determined. They are determined. We're going to play this out to the end. We're going to see how it goes. And maybe, just maybe, we'll win. Like they seem to still have this delusion that they have a chance against God, even though God is literally raining down 100-pound hailstones on their heads, destroying their cities, destroying their vehicles, destroying their homes, probably destroying their lives if they come in contact with them. I mean, this is just astonishing. And yet, it just shows at this point, the hardness of human hearts are just so extreme. It kind of shows you why we got to this point in the first place. Why are all these things happening? Why are these plagues coming? Because of the hardness of men's hearts. And even when they're confronted with the fact that they're puny next to God, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep fighting, keep pushing back, keep trying to stop everybody from doing God's will. But before we dive into a description of chapter 17 and online, before we move on to chapter 17, a couple more pieces of details I want to show to you, okay? The next major sub-point here, while all the world's cities will suffer from this judgment, right? It seems like it's a worldwide thing. All the cities of the earth are devastated over this, including Jerusalem. Even Jerusalem is not spared. God singles out one city, culture, empire, and I'll explain this in a minute, for his final judgment. He focuses in verse 19. It says, the great city was split into three parts, and the cities of the nation fell. And listen to this. And God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. So, even though it's clear that this judgment is for all the cities in the world, right? Including Jerusalem, the great city. He specifically has in mind Babylon the Great for this final judgment. In fact, Babylon the Great is really the cause of why this judgment has come about. Because God wants to finally judge Babylon the Great for all the wickedness and all the sins that she has committed. Now, why did I say in my notes here, the city / culture / empire? Because oftentimes in the Bible, God refers to an entire culture or government or empire or ethnic group by simply referring to the chief city of that empire, right? And that the city, the main city, the capital sort of stands for the whole thing. So when he says Babylon, he's not just referring to one little city where X amount of people live. He's talking about the empire that's connected to, that has its capital in Babylon. Like we do this all the time. We talk about Washington did this. You know, well, boy, here we go. Another set of laws from Washington. Oh, more taxes coming from Washington. Well, is it coming from the city? Is it coming from the District of Columbia? Or does Washington represent a bigger entity, which has got its fingers all over the 50 states, which is the federal government, right? As opposed to state governments. You know, if we're looking for a bailout from Washington, we're looking for a bailout from the federal government And Washington is the word we use that sort of just summarizes the entire culture, the entire government, the entire empire. So when he says Babylon the Great, he's talking not just about a city, but a city that represents a larger empire that's going to have an influence really all throughout the world. And the next 2.5 chapters, 17, 18, and just a little bit of 19, is going to focus in on this particular city / culture / empire. Now, the hard part in just a moment is going to be trying to identify with any sense of clarity and certainty exactly what Babylon the Great is referring to. Because clearly it's being used in a symbolic way to send a message to us. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But let me talk first about this really interesting expression where it says in verse 19, God remembered Babylon the Great. Now, I heard that expression today as I was reading and kind of getting ready for this video recording today, and I realized something. That's not normally the way the word remember is used in the Bible, okay? Now, what do I mean by that? Look at this ironic remembering, the next subpoint. Then the first little star underneath that says, when God remembers in the Bible 29 times, and I went through the effort today to look them up in the Bible and look up every time where God says that he remembers something. 29 times when God remembers something, it's a good thing. The very first, by the way, is a really interesting one connected to worldwide judgment, because in Genesis chapter 8, I should say Genesis chapter 6, God tells Noah to build the ark, right? Gives all the instructions. Genesis 7, God sends the rain, which leads to the worldwide flood, which of course destroys the whole earth and everybody except for the ark and Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their 3 wives, and then all the animals, of course, that are being protected inside of the ark. So that's chapter 7. And in chapter 7, what you see, really interesting, we'll look at it sometime in more detail. But the way the writer describes it, Moses describes it, he talks about how everything's like the water is rising, and the ark is sort of floating on top of this gigantic flood across the whole world, which is hard to believe, sure, but this is a pretty cataclysmic thing that God is describing. And it's like, it's getting worse, and then right at the point of the highest tension in the story, the question is, how are Noah and his family and these animals, how are they going to survive this incredible judgment that seems determined to swallow up the entire world? How are they going to do this? And the answer seems to be Genesis 8, verse 1. It says, God remembered Noah and all the animals in the ark. And then the waters start to recede. So it's like judgment's going to kill us all. And then God remembers. And then you see in chapter 8, the waters recede to the point where they're able to come out of the ark about a year later and walk again on dry land and restart the story of the world. In chapter 9, God remembering is a good thing. If you look all through the book of Genesis and really most of the rest of the Old Testament, whenever God remembers something, he's remembering a promise he made to somebody. He's remembering Abraham. He's remembering Rachel, who couldn't have a child. He's remembering Hannah, another godly woman who wanted a child and couldn't have a child. And most of the time, God is remembering his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the people have sinned, and they deserve to be judged, and they're punished by God. And then right when he's about to wipe them out completely, it says he remembers the promises he made, and so he delays his action. Or he comes and he rescues the people, all right? When God remembers in the Old Testament, it's almost always a good thing. Here's some blanks for you. God remembers his promises, that's the first blank, promises to various people, and he then moves to help them in some way. In fact, it would be a really fun study for you to go to BibleGateway.com and just type in the word remember. And I think you'll get quite a few. You'll get a lot of occurrences, and as you go through, just look and see who's talking and who is doing the remembering. And if God is doing the remembering, it'll be interesting to see the context. Who does he remember? And then what usually comes about because of that. Another category of this word remember in the Old Testament that I didn't really even take the time to write for you is this. Really interesting. There are some things that God deliberately chooses not to remember, right? Like the most famous one from Psalm, I think 103, is our sins and iniquities he will not remember anymore. He will remember no more. So not only is usually when God remembers something, it's good because then he's going to go help you. Oh, I remember I made you a promise. Let me help you. There's also some things God has promised he will not remember, and that's going to work out to our favor too. When he doesn't remember our sin and iniquity, and he forgives, or he doesn't remember them, and he allows us to live on. That's another example of this word remember being attached to a positive outcome for humanity. However, really interesting thing, the next little star point here. There are times when God remembers someone's, and here's the next blank, iniquity or sin, if you want to save yourself some space. There are times when God remembers someone's iniquity in the Bible, 7 times. So on the one hand, you have 29 times where it's positive, then probably another 12 to 15 times where he doesn't remember something that ends up positive. And then 7 times he says he remembers people's iniquity. It's almost like God is not going to judge. He's delaying his judgment. He's waiting. And in that time, it's like he's forgetting about it. I'm not going to worry about it. But then it's like, oh, I remember now. Obviously, I know that's not exactly the way it works out. But the way it describes it, it's almost like God remembers their iniquity. And when it does, 7 times, it means that judgment is going to quickly follow. So if God goes out of his way to remember your iniquity, you are toast. You're done. Okay? Now, of that 7 times, one time he talks about remembering the iniquity of somebody in the book of Jeremiah, once in Ezekiel. For some reason, the book of Hosea mentions it 3 times, this idea of God remembering people's iniquity and then punishing them. And then twice here in Revelation, you have God saying he's going to remember, and then there's an immediate judgment. And in this case, what he's remembering is that it's time to punish Babylon the Great. God remembers Babylon, but it's not a positive thing. It's time for them to be judged. Take a look at Revelation 18, 4 through 5. So skip ahead to the next chapter. I'm going to pick up this little piece of chapter 18. It says, "Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities.'" This is bad news. Just like when God remembers his promises and then he takes action to help people, he is now remembering that it's time to judge Babylon, and that judgment is going to lead to catastrophic results of judgment for Babylon. Now, what judgment does God pour upon Babylon? Uses a really interesting word picture here that also emerges from the Old and the New Testaments. And remember how I talked about how John, as he's writing the book of Revelation, it's almost like he has one finger in the Old Testament at all times. And if he possibly can make a connection between what he is seeing in this vision with an Old Testament promise or an Old Testament warning of judgment or an Old Testament image, he'll do it because he wants people who have read the Old Testament to realize that his book, Revelation, is finishing up the story that was begun back in the day. So John is very careful to be like, look, this is connected to the Old Testament. And so Babylon is going to get a specific judgment. And what is that judgment? Take a look again in chapter 16, verse 19. God remembered Babylon the Great. Oh, this is about to be bad. What does he remember? And then what happens? To make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. So, what is her judgment? To drain the cup, and that's the next blank here that you want to fill in, to drain the cup of his wrath. The cup of his wrath. Now, I think I did a message about this one Sunday a long time ago on a communion Sunday. Because this idea of drinking the wine of God's wrath is a very common Old Testament picture. Okay? Whenever God is warning the nations about the judgment that's to come, he uses the word picture of him offering you a goblet full of wine, and in this wine that you drink, and the wicked have to drink it says drain it, not just to drink the cup, like sip it, right? You're going to drain it down to the very last drop. Every available drop of wrath, you're going to swallow Babylon. Just like in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, in Isaiah, I think in Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, there's like a lot of different places where God says, look, wicked nations, when your turn comes, and your turn is going to come, you're going to drink from the cup of the wine of my wrath. This is a very common Old Testament image. And it involves two things usually. The first one is humiliation. Humiliation. Because God compares the experience of drinking the wine of his wrath with overindulging in regular wine. When you overindulge in regular wine and you have no temperance and you drink to excess, what happens to you? When you have too much alcohol content in your blood, you get drunk. And in being drunk, most often is when you lose some of your better sense, right? You lose all of those things that stop you from doing and saying stupid things. You lose all your inhibitions. You lose all of your sense of, maybe I should think this. Like, you just don't think anymore. You just act. And usually the times that people do things that they're most ashamed of are times when they're under the influence of alcohol or of wine, when they get drunk. And so when God says, I'm gonna make you drink the cup of my wrath, part of what he's saying is there's going to be humiliation for you in that process. You are going to be subject to embarrassment for the rebellion that you've committed against me. And the world is going to look at your foolishness and look at the judgment that comes next. And they're going to go, oh yeah, of course that person deserves to be judged. Look at the way they're acting. So God oftentimes will allow us to do exactly what we want to do, no matter how dumb, foolish, or ridiculous that it is, because that's part of the punishment. Part of the punishment are the stupid things that you do while you're under the influence of the thing that you want that actually turns out to be damaging to you. So God allows us to experience the consequences of our own foolishness. But then, unfortunately, involved in this wine, it's not just, oh gosh, I feel really dumb, I'm really a bad person. It's not just that feeling, it's also the judgment, or if you want to put the word destruction, okay? Because this is not going to end well. In fact, it talks about later on in 17 and 18 about her as a city being lit on fire and burnt up and destroyed. They're gonna burn her flesh with fire. I mean, they're gonna devour her flesh. I mean, they use some really powerful word pictures to describe not just, oh, a little slap on the wrist. Like, this is the devastation of their culture. Whatever city that is being described here, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, whatever culture is being described, whatever empire or influencer or government that's being talked about here with this Babylon the Great, she's going to be humiliated for her own foolishness of abandoning and rebelling against God. It's going to be obvious to the whole world how foolish and ridiculous they were to abandon God. And then secondly, not only, it's like, having your cake and eating it too, like you're going to get all your humiliation you can handle, and then you're also going to get the destruction that goes along with it. So, yeah, this is not going to end well for Babylon. And notice also too, one more interesting connection to earlier in the book that we've already studied. It says here in verse 20, and every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. Now, if you just read that in isolation, you haven't been reading the whole book, you're like, now what does that have to do with anything? No island fled away, no mountains were to be found. But we have been paying attention, poor things. You've been enduring this with me for eons now. Back in Revelation chapter 6, the first time there's a judgment from God, in that judgment, everybody wakes up and goes, oh no, we went a little too far, and now God's wrath and the wrath of the Lamb are going to be poured against us. And it says they go looking for holes in the ground where they can hide, and they ask the mountains and rocks to fall on them and hide them. And in that context, it says this in Revelation chapter 6, verse 14. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So it gets shaken up back in chapter 6, and now here they are in chapter 16, and the final earthquake has come, the final evidence of God's wrath has come, every island has fled away, and you can't even find the mountains. There's nowhere to hide. And that's what goes in that final blank there, the last blank. There was no safe place where you could hide from God's wrath. Basically, his judgment is unavoidable. There's no way out of it. There's no way to escape it. There's no island you can go to run from God's wrath. There's no mountain you can hide in the depths of to escape God's wrath. His wrath is coming. It's coming for you. It's going to hit you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's pretty dire. It's a pretty dire situation. So that's the opening paragraph there, wrapping up chapter 16 about this seventh bowl judgment. But now, verse 1, we're going to find out that John and the angels and God, through obviously John and the angels, want us to understand something a little bit more about this ancient enemy of God's called Babylon. I think what they want us to do is make sure we identify who Babylon is, at least as best we can, and then also understand elements of what that judgment is going to look like. Okay? So before we're done today, I'm going to try to help us answer that first question, which is, what exactly does Babylon the Great refer to? What does it refer to? And then once we get after that, the rest of it will be a little bit easier, I think, to fall in line with. Let me just read for a couple minutes. Chapter 17, verses 1 down through we'll just go to verse 6. Then one of the seven angels, who had the seven bowls, basically he's done his job, right? He poured out the bowl, and now he's like standing around heaven, doesn't have anything to do. I'm sorry, angel. I'm sure you're very busy and doing important work. I'm just making a joke. Then one of the seven angels, who had the seven bowls, came and said to me, "Come, I will show you" what? The judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters. Okay, I'm not sure exactly what seated on many waters looks like. If there's just like, she's walking on water and but he shows a symbolic picture of this woman that apparently is now going to be a symbolic representation of Babylon the Great, which we know is a city already. So it's a group of people, not just one woman, but he uses like a symbolic representation of Babylon as this woman. He calls her a prostitute. Okay, so this is not starting off really well for Babylon here. And he says, I want to come show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. So again, really interesting. We go back to the whole drinking from the cup thing, right? And getting drunk. God says to Babylon, you're going to drink the wine of my wrath. And she, before that, has been causing the dwellers of the earth to become drunk with her sexual immorality. So there's a very interesting play there going. God's almost like saying, okay, so you're going to cause the world to become filled with and drunk and completely made fools of and humiliated by their desire to, get involved in sexual immorality. Like their wanton sexual immorality is going to cause them to be humiliated. And that's your fault. You're the one that led the nations down the road towards sexual immorality. And you think you're the one kind of pulling the strings, and you're the one offering the cup. You're the one tempting people, drink from this. This will make you feel great, and then go do whatever you want. You think you're the boss, but really in the end, you're going to be the one drinking from your cup. And in fact, for every potion that you made them drink, you're going to have to drink double, and you're going to face double the consequences for what you've done. And he carried me away, verse 3, in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, we know who that guy is, right? We've talked about 2 beasts already, if you go back to chapter 13. Now, he's not called a scarlet beast in chapter 13, but he is described as being someone who utters blasphemies, right? So the fact that he has blasphemous names written on him tells us that this is probably the exact same beast who is leading the rebellion against God on earth, who's the dragon, who is Satan's chief lieutenant on earth, who some people have called the Antichrist. The Antichrist is this scarlet beast. There's no additional, it's very clear he's connecting those 2 terms together. And it had 7 heads and it had 10 horns, which again is another thing that's been used to describe the beast back in chapter 13, and also from another beast going back to Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2. We won't go into all that. We've already done that. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of what? Not the cup of the wrath of God, right? Not saying, here you go, people, you're going to drink from God's wrath. There's from drinking from the cup of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And just in case we miss who this person is or who this person represents, verse 5, on her forehead was written a name of mystery. What's the name? Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes, and mother of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. So, here we go. What exactly does Babylon the Great refer to? She's being pictured as a woman. She's being pictured as a prostitute who is seducing the world to drink this wine. And the wine is a wine of abominations against God, which means if you drink these abominations and you live according to this sexually immoral lifestyle, what will you have to drink from God later? You're not just drinking her cup of abominations. Someday, like Babylon, you, as a wicked person, are going to drink from the cup of God's wrath too. Of course, that's not marketed in the original drinking from the cup, right? When she's holding out her cup of abominations, she's not saying, oh, and by the way, in 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 85 years, unfortunately, I got to tell you, if you drink deep of this cup here of abominations, yeah, you're going to have a lot of fun for 85 years, but then you will be destroyed by God. You'll be humiliated by God. She never markets it. She just says, hey, drink this, it'll make you feel good, right? Which tells you a lot about even our world today, but that's another story for another time. So here she is holding this. On her forehead is a name. She's identified as Babylon the Great. And she's called the mother of prostitutes, and she's the mother of earth's abominations. In other words, it's almost like John and the angels are pointing to this city, this culture, this government, this empire, whatever this is, this power structure called Babylon the Great. And it seems to be the source of the cancer that it's affecting the planet. So like all of the sexual immorality in the world, where did it start from? It started from Babylon. How about the other abominations, the idol worship and the persecution of God's people and worshiping the beast as if he were God and blasphemy? Where do all those abominations come from? Seemingly, they have their source here in this entity called Babylon the Great that's described as a woman who's a prostitute seated on the back of this beast who's the Antichrist. Okay? But let's try to figure this out. It's called Babylon the Great. So there's a couple of possibilities about what this represents or what it's referring to. And the first option, right, is that Babylon the Great that's judged here in Revelation 17 and 18, Babylon the Great is actually, and here's the first star underneath, so what exactly does Babylon the Great refer to? The first star says it could be referring to the ancient city of Babylon. Sorry, it's obvious, but I wanted to give you a blank to fill in. And Mesopotamia would be too hard for you to spell. So the ancient city of Babylon in Mesopotamia, okay? Now, if you want to know where Mesopotamia is, Mesopotamia means between the two rivers. What are the two rivers? The Tigris River and the Euphrates River. I got really interesting news for you. Both of those rivers still exist today in modern-day Iraq. So when we fought the Gulf War and then the second Gulf War under George W. Bush, and we actually invaded Iraq and we took over and we removed Saddam Hussein, we were fighting on this land between the two rivers of Mesopotamia where the ancient city of Babylon used to be. So what they could be referring to Babylon is that here is literally the old city of Babylon that used to exist there, that was the head of the Babylonian Empire, that has now been rebuilt as an end-time civilization that leads the world astray, allied with the beast. So that's one option. One option is this is Babylon in Iraq rebuilt. And it's rebuilt for a new purpose. And that new purpose is to lead the nations astray and to be allied with the beast, right? She's riding on top of the beast. So she depends upon the beast for support. The beast is the one that kind of holds her up so she can do her work. So that's one possibility. And one of the reasons that that's very possible and likely is because it uses the word Babylon to describe her. So Babylon, as you know, or as I've talked about at length before, Babylon was the seat of power of the Babylonian Empire that spread throughout the whole earth for a time back in the, I'm trying to think, the 500s. 500s BC? Yeah, in the 500s BC. And the Babylonian Empire was a big deal. Nebuchadnezzar was probably the high point of that empire. Nebuchadnezzar is a figure from history that has been proven to have been real, not just because the Bible said so, but all kinds of evidence as well. And really interesting, cool stuff. Nebuchadnezzar is a real figure from history. And Nebuchadnezzar was sort of the head of Babylon. And the Babylon was, again, a city that represents an entire empire that spread throughout the entire earth. So if you remember anything about Babylon, you remember that Babylon destroyed Israel. God allowed Babylon to come in and destroy Israel for her sins. And in the process of destroying Israel, also melted down the temple, took everything out of the temple, all of God's stuff that were used to worship the one true God, and they took them to the temples of his gods, and he put them there. And then all of the Israelites that survived the sacking and pillaging of Jerusalem and of the surrounding towns and villages were basically, rounded up, and then they were led away as slaves into other parts of the empire of Babylon. And the people of God were in captivity for about 70 years before they were allowed to return to the Holy Land to rebuild the temple and rebuild their homes. Okay? But basically, whenever you would say Babylon to somebody who lived either during the time of the Babylonian Empire or who lived after the time of the Babylonian Empire or who lived in Jesus' day, Babylon was like the boogeyman. Babylon represented the enemies of God. It's almost like it was a shorthand, an abbreviation for enemy of God who destroys and oppresses God's people. That's what Babylon represented. It was like the boogeyman who you told your kids stories about at night, that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came to destroy and melt down the temple, and it was a scary, scary part of their story. So it's possible that this thing that gets destroyed in the end times by God is that civilization kind of reborn. And this civilization now has its goal to lead the world astray, but also to work with the beast to help support the beast's claims in the earth. So perhaps it's referring to a city located somewhere, will be rebuilt somewhere in modern day Iraq. That's very possible. However, of course, there is no city right now in that same location that's been built. There's no city called Babylon in our world today. So is there another option that we should consider as a possibility? And I think there is. And it's a little bit complex, but I'm going to take about the next 10 minutes or so and try to explain it to you. Why I actually think that it's not referring to a city that's being built somewhere in the desert or in the area between the two rivers in Iraq, but is actually, here's the next star there, the ancient city of Rome. I think when he uses the term Babylon here, he's referring in a symbolic and roundabout way to the city of Rome, which, if you remember, when Revelation is being written in the late 1st century, who is the current world empire that rules the earth? That in many ways is the enemy of God's people, the Jews, because they destroyed Jerusalem again, right? They destroyed the temple again in AD 70, which is about 20 years before the book of Revelation is being written here, or maybe 20, 25 years. And they're the today's Babylon. Like, they're the enemies of God today, just like Babylon was the enemies of God and God's people back in the 500s BC. So I think this is a roundabout way to describe the ancient city of Rome, which I know exists today in one form, but it's going to be reimagined in the end times as the capital of the beast's worldwide end times empire. Okay? So some kind of a rebuilt, reimagined, revived Rome is being described here as Babylon the Great. Now, let me give you 3 reasons why I think that's the case, and then we'll be done for today. Number 1, look at the subpoint underneath that star, where it says 17, 3, and 9. Let's read verse 3 and then skip down to verse 9 again. Verse 3 says, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names and it had 7 heads, okay? 7 heads. So she's sitting on the beast, and the beast has 7 heads that are underneath, kind of supporting her, okay? Skip down to verse 9, it tells us what those 7 heads represent. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. So, the 7 heads of the beast represent 7 mountains, and she's seated on or built. She's a city. She's not a woman, right? The woman is a symbol of the city. The city is built on 7 hills or 7 mountains. Now, Rome, if you know anything about Rome or the history of Rome, Rome is a very extremely ancient city. And sort of the legends about how Rome was established back in the day were by these 2 brothers who were raised by wolves. That's kind of this weird story, but they're raised by wolves. They come and they build the city of Rome on the 7 hills around this river. And so the ancient world knew this legend. And so the reference to the 7 hills or the 7 mountains on which he was built could have been a reference to the legend about the 7 hills that the ancient city of Rome was built on. So it's possible that when he says 7 mountains here that she's resting on, he's sort of giving you a hint, it is indirect, but an indirect hint that he's talking about the city of the 7 hills. Well, what's the city that's built on the 7 hills? What's the city that's rampaging throughout the world, running the world, and seems to be in direct opposition to God and his ways in the 1st century? Well, that's Rome. So he must, I think, this leads me to believe that he's referring to the ancient city of Rome, reimagined in the end times as the capital city of the beast's empire. Now, second reason. The beast on which the prostitute is seated is identified as the same beast from chapter 13. We already talked about that, right? The Antichrist. So she is seated, the city, this culture, this civilization, this government structure, this empire, is seated on the beast. Well, who is the beast? The beast from Revelation 13 goes back to the visions God gave to Daniel in Daniel chapter 2 and in Daniel chapter 7. And that beast is identified with a revived Roman Empire. He goes through the succession of empires. He starts with Babylon, then he goes to Persia, the Medes and the Persians, then he goes to Greece, and then he talks about a 4th kingdom, which is more savage. It's the legs of iron, right? That's Rome. And then the feet and the toes are mixed together. That represents a final revived Roman Empire. And in chapter 7, there's this beast that comes out, the 4th kingdom, and it's worse than the rest. And Daniel, the angel tells Daniel, this is the beast represents this final world ruler who's going to fight against the Messiah, and there's going to be a final struggle in the kingdom of Israel. Well, it seems to make sense that John is connecting this whole thing about her being on top of this beast, and then connecting the beast through chapter 13 all the way back to Daniel's vision, that perhaps he's already got in his mind that this is a revived Roman Empire. But then the third reason is that elsewhere in the New Testament, the word Babylon is used to refer in an indirect way to the city of Rome. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter says, "She who is in Babylon greets you." She who is in Babylon greets you. Now, Babylon did not exist in Peter's day. Peter, however, spent a lot of time in the church in Rome. And so what a lot of scholars believe, is that when he says she who is in Babylon, he's talking about the churches that were meeting in the city of Rome. And again, remember, Rome is not kind to Christians at the end of the 1st century. There's people being rounded up. Nero in the 60s, which is a few years before the book of Revelation, Nero goes on this vast, serious persecution of Christians, and various other Caesars afterwards continue these persecutions throughout the Roman Empire. So it's very likely that Peter, when he's writing, he doesn't want to call a lot of attention to where he is in Rome, because he's living in Rome, and he knew that he'd be subject. If anybody got a hold of a copy of it, they might think Peter is some kind of revolutionary, and they might want to come after Peter. So he uses this oblique way, this opaque way of referring to Rome, and he calls her Babylon. Now, why would Rome be identified with Babylon? Well, for the reasons I've already told you. Rome and Babylon are connected together by several things. Both cities and both cultures and both civilizations that they represent, both empires, both Babylonia and Rome, the Roman Empire, they were enemies of God. They destroyed God's people. They destroyed the temple. Both of them did. Babylon destroyed the temple, and then Rome destroyed the second temple in AD 70. Both of them were oppressors and captivators of God's people. They took God's people captive, and Babylonians carried them away to Babylonia. The Romans let them stay, but then they put a garrison of soldiers there to force them to stick with Rome and pay taxes to Rome. And also, both cities destroyed Jerusalem. Both cities destroyed the temple. Both civilizations led God's people into captivity. So it makes sense, perhaps, that early Christians, beyond Peter, linked those two cities together, which I think could be why John is using the same terms to describe the city of Rome today. Okay, now this is going to drive you crazy, but now I'm basically going to say it doesn't really matter. And people are like, but you just spent all this time explaining why you think it's Rome and not the original city of Babylon. I know. But there's some things you can know with certainty, and then there's some things you can't. And this is one of those things that I don't think we can know with 100% certainty. The best we can do is to kind of come up with our reasons, have our explanations, and then sort of say, I think, I guess, I suppose, and then let it be. Because here's my last point here. Wherever the capital is located, it seems clear that Babylon the Great is a city, which, remember, represents a whole civilization, allied with the beast in enmity or against God and God's people, right? So at the very least, what we can say is, okay, I don't know if it's going to be in Iraq. I don't know if it's going to be in Italy, in Rome. I don't know where this city is going to be. But this city and this civilization is basically the beast's capital of his empire. And it's allied with the beast, and it's against God. Now, as long as you have that, you can understand the rest of what's going to go on here. You don't need to know exactly where it's located in the actual world to understand that this is a group of people who have shaken their fist at God, who are not interested in God's rulership over them, but are very much allied with, and remember, she's sitting on top of the beast. So wherever the beast is, she's dependent upon the beast for her life and her survival. She leans on him. She is going to provide probably part of the government structure for his empire. Okay? So that's Babylon the Great, and that is the civilization that is about to be judged by God. And what we're going to look at next week, is we're going to talk about the rest of these blanks, which are, okay, what are her crimes? Like, what did she do wrong? Like, why is she being judged? That's important. And then, what will her judgment look like? Like, how does she meet her end? And then, interestingly enough, what are the various reactions to her judgment? Because these are the things that the text focuses on. And even though you're like, but can we just get back to the story? Like, we just had the seventh bowl judgment poured out. Is Jesus going to come back finally and destroy all the wicked and set up his kingdom? Or is this going to keep going and going? Before we can get to that, John and God and the writer of scriptures here want us to focus on Babylon. So we're going to focus on Babylon for one more week. And then first Sunday in February, that'll be Super Bowl Sunday. Super Bowl Sunday, we will talk more about the second coming of Christ. And hopefully, Bills fans, you'll have something to be cheering about that day. But we'll see. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I can't see the future. So that's where we're at. Come back next week, and we'll talk a little bit more about Babylon the Great and try to figure out, what did she do that was so bad that caused God to react to such a strong way to judge her for her sins. Love you guys. See you next Sunday.